My name is Maria from Brazil, and I want to keep telling my story, because if I don't, the truth might just disappear into the red dust of the sertão, like everything else does. I didn't say yes, but no one cared. That is the simplest way I can explain the night my father chose my husband. People imagine these kinds of decisions as explosive, dramatic, full of shouting and rebellion, but the truth is far quieter and far more suffocating than that. It did not feel like a scene from a movie. There was no storm outside, no dramatic confrontation, no plates shattering against walls. There was just heat. The kind of heat that does not leave when the sun goes down. The kind that clings to the inside of your lungs and makes every breath feel borrowed. That evening looked ordinary. And that is what makes it dangerous. Life-changing moments rarely announce themselves with thunder. They sit at the table like routine guests. My father was already seated when I entered the room. He sat at the head of the wooden table the way he always did, as if the position had been carved into the floor for him alone. My mother stood near the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a cloth that was already dry. No one spoke at first. The silence was not unusual. In our house, silence was the safest form of communication. I had learned over the years that the tone of my father's breathing could tell me more than his words ever would. If he came home loud, there would be noise, but it would pass. If he came home silent, something heavier was forming. That night he was calm in a way that felt rehearsed. He cleared his throat once, not aggressively, not impatiently, just enough to signal that what he was about to say did not require discussion. "There is a man," he said. That was it. No introduction, no context, just an announcement placed in the middle of the table between us, like a document already signed. I knew who he meant before he said the name. In a small town, you know every possibility long before it becomes official. I had seen the man at church, at the market, once near the well. He was older than me, not old enough to shock anyone, but old enough that the difference mattered. He had land, he had cattle, he had a house that did not leak when it rained. These were the qualities that counted. No one had ever asked whether he was kind. Kindness is not a measurable asset in negotiations like that. Stability is. My father continued speaking in the same tone someone might use to describe planting season. Practical, efficient, detached. The arrangement made sense. The families aligned. The future would be secure. He spoke about responsibility and opportunity and how a good marriage is built on structure, not emotion. He never once asked what I thought. The decision did not hover in the air, waiting for approval. It landed fully formed. "You will marry him," he said. There was no question mark at the end of that sentence. It did not rise in pitch. It did not leave space for response. It was delivered the way you state a fact about the weather. The sun rises in the east. The harvest will be next month. You will marry him. In that moment, something inside me attempted to move, not loudly, not heroically, just a small internal shift, like a muscle remembering it exists. A word formed somewhere behind my ribs. No. It was fragile and unfamiliar. I had not used it often. In our house, no was a word that carried consequences, and consequences were rarely fair. I felt it travel upward, almost reaching my throat, and then I swallowed it. I did not swallow it because I agreed. I swallowed it because I already understood the cost. Silence, in that room, functioned as consent. If you did not resist, you agreed. If you did not object, you approved. And I had been trained in the art of non-resistance for years. You survive by minimizing. You survive by not escalating. You survive by becoming smaller than the conflict in front of you. I had become very skilled at that. My mother never interrupted. She did not look at me while he spoke. Her hands rested flat against the table, steady and still. I watched her fingers because it was easier than looking at my father's face. They did not tremble. They did not clench. They simply existed, quiet and obedient. At one point, just for a second, she lifted her eyes. Our gazes met. There was something there, but it was not rebellion. It was recognition. She understood what was happening. She understood that I would not be asked again. She also understood that she would not intervene, not because she lacked love, but because love in that house had boundaries shaped by fear. My father explained the practicalities. The date would be arranged. The families would meet formally. There would be a modest celebration. He spoke about it as if he were describing repairs to the roof, necessary maintenance for the future. I sat there listening to the blueprint of a life I had not chosen unfold in front of me. The strange part is that no one restrained me. No one raised a hand. The absence of visible force makes the story harder to tell. It is easier to explain bruises than it is to explain inevitability. When he finished, he stood up. The chair legs scraped against the floor in a slow, dragging sound that seemed louder than his entire speech. That sound stayed with me. It marked the end of discussion. He walked out of the room without asking for acknowledgement. He did not need it. The decision did not depend on my agreement. The house felt different after he left, as if the air had thickened even more. My mother remained seated. I waited for her to say something, anything, perhaps a whispered apology or a fragment of advice. She did not. She reached for the cloth beside her and began folding it carefully, smoothing invisible wrinkles. The domestic gesture felt almost cruel in its normalcy. Life does not pause for your internal collapse. The dishes still need drying. The floor still needs sweeping. The next morning still arrives. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling, wood creaking, wind pressing against the shutters. I imagined alternate versions of myself. In one version I had stood up and shouted. In another I had run out the door and kept running until the red earth turned into something else entirely. In those imagined stories I was brave and dramatic and unafraid of consequence, but imagination is generous in ways reality is not. In reality I stayed. I breathed carefully. I prepared. People later would call it tradition. They would say it was normal, that it was how things had always been done. Tradition is a powerful word. It wraps itself around decisions and makes them appear honorable. But sometimes tradition is simply control that has been repeated long enough to feel natural. No one asked whether I loved him. Love was not the objective. Security was. Reputation was. Order was. I did not say yes. That is true. But I did not say no either. And in that house, neutrality was interpreted as acceptance. By the time the arrangements became public, it was spoken of as if I had agreed enthusiastically. Smiles were exchanged. Congratulations were offered. I learned how quickly a narrative can be rewritten when the main character remains silent. The night my father chose my husband did not explode. It settled. It folded itself neatly into the structure of our lives. It proved something I had already suspected. In certain rooms, your future can be decided without your participation. And the most unsettling part is not the lack of choice. It is how normal it feels while it is happening. The next day, the world didn't look any different, which felt like a personal insult from the universe. I woke up at 5, just like always, to the sound of the roosters screaming like they had a personal grudge against the morning sun. I went to the kitchen and the smell of coffee was already there, thick and bitter. My mother was already at the stove. She didn't look at me. She didn't say, "I'm sorry your life was traded for 24 head of cattle and a fence made of barbed wire." She just pushed a plate of bread toward me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her face was like a mask made of stone. This is what the Sertao does to you. It teaches you that crying is a waste of water, and water is the only thing more precious than your soul. I remember walking to the market that Sunday, and it felt like I was walking to my own funeral, except everyone was throwing confetti instead of dirt. Manuel was there, leaning against a post near the grain cellar. He was wearing a hat that looked like it had seen better decades, and boots that were polished so bright they hurt my eyes. He smiled at me, a slow, possessive grin that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the smile of a man who liked me. It was the smile of a man who had just closed a very profitable real estate deal. He tipped his hat to my father, and they shook hands, a firm, dry grip that sealed my fate. The town gossips were already circling. Donna Lucia, whose voice sounded like sandpaper on wood, leaned in close enough for me to smell the tobacco on her breath. "You're a lucky one, Maria," she whispered, her eyes darting around to make sure everyone heard. "Manuel is a man of substance. You won't be hungry like the rest of us." I wanted to tell her that I'd rather be hungry and free than full and caged. But the words were stuck in my throat like dry corn. I just nodded. I let the congratulations wash over me like dirty river water. Every person who shook my hand was adding another brick to the wall. At church, the priest talked about the sanctity of marriage and the beauty of a woman's obedience. I sat there in the hard wooden pew and felt like the walls were closing in, inch by inch, until there was only enough room for me to stand perfectly still. I looked up at the ceiling of the church, at the peeling paint and the dust motes dancing in the light. And I realized that God wasn't going to send a miracle. No one was coming to rescue the girl who wouldn't say no. That afternoon, my mother started sewing a dress. It wasn't white, white was for girls who lived in the city, girls who had hope. It was a pale, dusty rose color, the color of a sunset that's already fading into a bruise. Every time the needle pierced the fabric, I felt it in my own chest. Pop, pop, pop. She worked in total silence, her hands moving with a frantic energy that terrified me. I realized then that this was her way of apologizing. She couldn't stop the marriage, so she would make the dress perfect. It was a pathetic trade, and we both knew it. I sat on the floor near her feet, and for a second, I felt like that 12-year-old girl again, the one who tried to train a chicken named Soldier. I missed that girl. I missed the way she used to laugh until her stomach hurt. Now, my stomach just felt like it was full of lead. I thought about Soldier, and I wondered if she'd ever escaped the yard, or if she'd just ended up in a pot like every other chicken that didn't know how to fly. The nights were the hardest. I would lie in my bed, staring at the 30 cracks in the ceiling, waiting for the world to make sense. I started having this recurring dream where I was running through the caatinga, the thorny brush. The thorns were tearing at my skin, leaving long red tracks on my arms and legs, but I couldn't stop. I could hear the thud-thud-thud of my father's boots behind me, but when I turned around, it wasn't my father. It was Manuel, and he was holding a cage that was shaped exactly like our house. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but the room would be silent, just the sound of the wind and the far-off bark of a dog. I started to hate the wind. In the Sertão, the wind is a thief. It steals the moisture from the air, the hope from the farmers, and the secrets from the houses. It carried the news of my engagement to every corner of the district, and within a week, my life wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the public. Even the way I walked was scrutinized. If I walked too fast, people said I was eager to get to Manuel's bed. If I walked too slow, they said I was ungrateful for the blessing I'd received. There was no winning. There was only the performance. One evening, Manuel came over for dinner. It was a formal affair, which meant we used the good ceramic plates, and my mother cooked a chicken. He sat where he always sat when he visited, across from my father. They talked about the drought, the price of steers, and the new government in the city. They talked about everything except me. I was the centerpiece of the table, a decorative item that didn't require a voice. At one point, Manuel reached across the table and touched my hand. His skin was rough, like sun-bleached wood, and his grip was a little too tight. "You're a quiet thing, Maria," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I like that. A house needs peace." I looked at him and tried to find a spark of anything: anger, fear, even hatred, but I just felt empty. I felt like I had already left my body and was watching the scene from the rafters. I saw my father nod with approval. I saw my mother look down at her plate, and I saw myself, the girl in the dusty rose dress, nodding back like a puppet on a string. That was the moment I realized that normal is the most terrifying word in the world. This was normal for them. This was the cycle. My grandmother had done it, my mother had done it, and now it was my turn. The wheels of tradition were grinding me down, and everyone was smiling because that's just how the grain is made. But something was shifting in the dark. That sarcastic, sportscaster voice in my head, the one that had been my only friend, wasn't making jokes anymore. She was starting to take notes. She was looking at the door. She was checking the latches. She was whispering that if the world decided my childhood had reached its expiration date, then maybe I should decide when the rest of my life began. I started to collect things. Not much. A few coins I found in the dirt, a sturdy pair of shoes I hid under the floorboards, a small knife I'd swiped from the kitchen. Small, insignificant things that felt like a rebellion. Every time I added something to my little stash, I felt a tiny spark of heat that didn't come from the sun. It was a different kind of fire. It was the kind of fire that burns down a house so you can see the stars. People ask me now, when I tell this story over coffee in a bright kitchen in New Jersey, how I survived. They look at me with pity, like I'm a broken thing that got glued back together. They don't understand that the breaking was the point. You have to break the vessel to see what's inside. My father thought he was giving me a future, but he was actually giving me a map. He showed me exactly what I didn't want to be. He showed me that security is just another word for a slow death. And he showed me that if you want to fly, you have to be willing to leave the ground. Even if the ground is the only thing you've ever known. The night before the wedding, the air was so still you could hear a spider spinning its web. I sat by the window and looked out at the moon. It was a thin, silver sliver, like a hook in the sky. I thought about the girl who wanted to be an icon in Europe, the girl who sang to the laundry, the girl who believed thunder was God moving furniture. She was still there, somewhere under the layers of silence and respect. She was waiting for me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't swallow the no. I let it sit on my tongue, tasting it like copper and honey. I didn't say it out loud, not yet. I didn't need to. The wind would carry it soon enough. My father's boots were silent in the next room. My mother's breathing was a soft, ragged rhythm. And in the dark, Maria from Brazil started to move. Not like a puppet, not like a ghost, but like a woman who had finally realized that the cage was only locked because she was still holding the bars. The red earth was waiting, and the thorns were sharp, but I wasn't running in a dream anymore. I was waking up. And in the Surtau, once the sun comes up, there's nowhere left to hide for the hunters or the prey. I looked at the dress hanging on the wall, that pale, dusty rose shroud, and I knew I would never wear it. I would rather walk naked through the thorns than spend 1 second in a life that wasn't mine. The expiration date on my childhood had passed, yeah, but the expiration date on my silence, that was tonight. I reached under the floorboards and felt the cool leather of my shoes. I felt the weight of the coins, and I felt the no in my chest turn into a yes, a real yes, a yes to the unknown, a yes to the danger, a yes to the girl who laughed too loud. The door was right there. All I had to do was walk through it, and as I stood up, the chair didn't make a sound. For the first time in my life, I was the one controlling the silence, and that, more than anything, was the sound of my freedom. I stepped out into the night, the heat finally lifting, and I didn't look back. The red dirt was behind me, and the world, the real world, the one that didn't care about cattle or reputation, was waiting. I was Maria from Brazil, and I was finally, the one deciding what happened next. Would you like me to tell you what I found on the other side of that door? Would you like me to describe the first breath I took that didn't feel borrowed? Because that's where the real story starts. That's where the star of Europe finally found her stage. Would you like to hear about the first time I saw the ocean, and how I realized it was even bigger than my father's fear? Or maybe you want to know about the moment I realized that my accent wasn't a flaw, but a map of how far I'd come. I'm ready to tell it all. No more silence, no more hiding, just me.